Imagine digging into the forest floor and discovering something that should not be there. Not a buried artifact. Not a forgotten foundation. A mine. A mine that had already been abandoned for centuries before the modern world even existed. That is essentially what happened in 1848 on Isle Royale, in the middle of Lake Superior. A crew working near Minong Ridge broke through layers of glacial soil and suddenly found themselves looking into an underground excavation. The walls followed a natural vein of native copper with remarkable precision. And at the bottom was something even more startling. A massive piece of almost pure copper, resting among charred wooden timbers. The men who discovered it could not simply lift it out. Someone had spent an enormous amount of time getting that copper from the rock. And then, for reasons nobody at the time could explain, they had abandoned it. The discovery was not an isolated accident. It was the beginning of a much larger realization. Across Isle Royale and Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula were thousands of ancient mining pits. Some were shallow. Others descended dozens of feet into the rock. Some even contained narrow underground passages that followed copper veins beneath the surface. And the people who created them had done so thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans. So who were these miners? How did they extract copper without modern metalworking equipment? Why did they operate on such a massive scale? And perhaps most importantly, where did all that copper go? Because the amount of copper believed to have been removed from this region is vastly greater than the amount archaeologists have recovered. That mystery still has no simple answer. To understand how extraordinary the 1848 discovery was, consider the landscape surrounding it. The miners were working in territory that had only become part of European exploration centuries earlier. But the excavation beneath their feet was dramatically older. One way the 19th century investigators tried to determine the age of these workings was surprisingly simple. They examined trees growing directly through ancient spoil heaps. One hemlock near an old excavation was estimated to be more than 3 centuries old. That meant the mining activity had taken place long before the tree had even begun growing. And that was only the visible evidence. As prospectors moved across the region during the copper rush of the 19th century, they repeatedly encountered the same problem. They weren't always discovering untouched mineral deposits. They were discovering somebody else's mines. Old pits appeared so frequently that mining companies began treating them almost like ordinary features of the landscape. Surveyors documented hundreds, then thousands. Some ancient workings were little more than depressions or shallow trenches. Others reached 30 feet or more beneath the surface. In certain locations, the miners had followed copper veins underground through narrow passages. The scale was becoming impossible to dismiss. This was not evidence of a few people occasionally picking up pieces of metal from exposed rock. Something much more organized had been happening here. For generations, perhaps for thousands of years. There is one unusual characteristic of Lake Superior copper that makes this story possible. The copper was already metallic. It did not need to be extracted from or through the kind of smelting technology that later became important in other parts of the ancient world. This material is called native copper. Nature had already done the refining. That meant ancient miners could concentrate on physically removing it from the surrounding rock. And they developed a remarkably simple method. Fire. Imagine an exposed copper-bearing rock face. A group of workers gathers wood and builds an intense fire against the stone. The heat penetrates the rock. Afterward, water is applied. The sudden change in temperature causes fractures. Now the stone can be attacked with hammerstones and other basic tools. Piece by piece, the miners break away the damaged rock and expose more copper. Then the process begins again. Fire, heat, water, fracture, hammering, removal. Again and again. It is primitive technology by modern standards. But primitive does not mean simple. The work demanded planning, labor, food, transportation, tool production, and coordination. A crew had to gather enormous amounts of fuel. It had to clear the broken stone. It had to transport the useful copper. And it had to repeat the process over and over. One small excavation might represent the work of many people over an extended period. Now multiply that by thousands of pits. The picture changes completely. The ancient copper industry was not created by some mysterious civilization that suddenly appeared and vanished. Archaeological evidence connects the broader old copper tradition with indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region, including ancestors of the Ojibwe, Menominee, and related communities. Their mining activity appears to have followed seasonal patterns. During warmer months, people could travel to the mining grounds, gather fuel, work the rock, and transport material across open water. At other times of year, communities dispersed to other settlements throughout the Great Lakes region. Copper could then be shaped into tools, weapons, ornaments, and other objects. This suggests something much bigger than a temporary expedition. The mines were part of a system. Mining was connected to manufacturing. Manufacturing was connected to transportation. And transportation was connected to exchange. The copper was not simply being pulled out of the ground and forgotten. It was entering a wider world. And archaeologists have found evidence of just how wide that world could be. Copper artifacts have been recovered hundreds and even more than 1,000 miles from Lake Superior. Chemical analysis has helped researchers identify connections between Lake Superior copper and objects discovered at important archaeological sites farther south. Among them are Hopewell sites in the Ohio Valley. Copper objects from places such as Mound City include elaborate ceremonial pieces. Other finds from the lower Mississippi Valley have also produced signatures consistent with Lake Superior copper. That means a piece of metal removed from a mine in northern Michigan could eventually travel an extraordinary distance, could change hands repeatedly. It could be hammered into a completely different object. This may be the greatest mystery surrounding the ancient mines. Historical estimates of the total amount removed from the ancient workings have reached hundreds of millions of pounds. Some estimates have gone even higher, but there is a huge mismatch. Archaeological collections contain copper tools, points, hooks, ornaments, bracelets, beads, and other objects. Yet these surviving artifacts represent only a tiny fraction of the copper believed to have been extracted. So where did the rest go? There are several possibilities. First, much of the copper may have traveled through ancient trade networks. Material could have moved far beyond the mining region. Second, copper could have been repeatedly recycled. A tool could be reshaped. An ornament could become another object. One generation could inherit metal from the previous generation and transform it into something entirely different. After enough cycles, there may be no obvious archaeological connection to the original mine. And there is another possibility. Some of the copper may still be underground. The 19th century surveys were nowhere near as comprehensive as modern mapping technology. And even today, researchers continue to identify previously undocumented ancient workings. Modern LiDAR surveys can look through forest canopies and detect subtle changes in the ground that would be nearly impossible to recognize from the surface. Depressions, spoil piles, old shafts, hidden traces of human excavation. The deeper researchers look, the more complicated the map becomes. And the full extent of the ancient mining landscape is still not completely known. The ancient miners were not extracting copper merely because it was shiny. Archaeological sites have produced a surprisingly diverse collection of copper objects. There are spear points, awls, fishing equipment, woodworking tools, knives, ornaments, beads, bracelets, and some of the objects reveal sophisticated solutions to practical problems. Among the most interesting are socketed spear points. Instead of simply attaching a metal point to the outside of a wooden shaft, the shaft could fit into a hollow portion of the metal. That created a different and potentially stronger connection. The archaeological record therefore shows copper becoming part of everyday technology. A fisherman could use copper equipment. A craftsman could use copper tools. A hunter could carry a copper point. And copper could also appear in ceremonial or personal objects. That variety tells us something important. Copper was not merely a rare luxury reserved for a tiny elite. It had become integrated into different areas of life. And this was happening incredibly early. Radiocarbon evidence from the region has produced dates placing some ancient copper extraction more than 7,000 years ago. Some later research has suggested dates approaching 9,500 years for particular samples. although the exact beginning of the industry remains debated. Even the more conservative dates are extraordinary. They place Great Lakes copper working among the oldest long-lasting metalworking traditions known. The Oconto site in Wisconsin provides another important piece of the story. Archaeologists uncovered burials containing copper objects including awls, spear points, and crescent-shaped knives. These objects were made by hammering and annealing native copper. They were not created through the kind of large-scale smelting technology associated with later metal industries. And this chronology is important. The Lake Superior copper tradition predates the better-known copper industries of the ancient Mediterranean by a substantial period. It existed long before bronze became the defining material of many ancient Old World civilizations. This was a completely separate technological path. Different geography, different tools, different cultural traditions, but an equally remarkable discovery. People had found a way to take naturally occurring metal and turn it into useful technology. By the 19th century, the Lake Superior region became the center of an enormous industrial rush. Geologists had already identified the extraordinary richness of the deposits. Michigan State geologist Douglas Houghton had surveyed the region before the copper boom reached its height, but he died in 1845 in Lake Superior. He would never see the industrial expansion his work helped encourage. Soon companies were staking claims across the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale. Shafts were sunk. Rock was blasted. Copper was hauled away. But the new mining industry repeatedly collided with the old one. Modern engineers would begin excavation and discover ancient pits beneath them. It was as though two completely different mining eras had occupied the same landscape. One used industrial machinery. The other had relied on fire, stone, wood, and human labor. And sometimes the older operation was directly in the way of the newer one. The physical evidence was becoming difficult to ignore, but the interpretation became deeply controversial. Some 19th-century writers were unwilling to accept that indigenous peoples could have built such an extensive mining system. Instead, theories emerged proposing vanished populations or mysterious outsiders. The ancient mines became part of a much broader 19th-century fascination with the idea that sophisticated structures in North America must have been created by someone other than indigenous Americans. This was not just an archaeological debate. There was a political dimension. The same period saw indigenous communities losing control of land through treaties and government pressure. Attributing ancient achievements to a vanished people made it easier for outsiders to separate those achievements from the living nations whose ancestors were still present. But some researchers argued against this interpretation. Engineer Charles Whittlesey investigated the Isle Royale workings in the 19th century. He documented ancient pits, wooden structures, tools, and the surrounding landscape. His conclusion was important. There was no need to invent a vanished civilization. The indigenous peoples of the region were entirely capable of building the mines. The physical evidence supported that conclusion, and eventually archaeology would reinforce it. The controversy did not end with the early surveys. In fact, some people went much further. During the late 19th century, forged artifacts began appearing in Michigan. Among the most infamous were supposed ancient tablets bearing strange inscriptions. The objects were promoted as evidence of an old world civilization having reached the region. But they were fraudulent. Modern analysis eventually showed that the tablets had been manufactured with modern tools and placed in archaeological contexts where they did not belong. The episode became part of a larger lesson. People were sometimes willing to accept almost any explanation for ancient American achievements as long as that explanation did not credit indigenous societies. The real archaeological evidence was far less sensational and far more interesting. There was no need for a lost European civilization. No mysterious outsiders were necessary. The mines themselves showed what indigenous communities had accomplished. And indigenous oral traditions had preserved memories of ancient copper working long before modern laboratories began confirming the chronology. Perhaps no object captures the conflict better than a massive native copper boulder from the Ontonagon River region. European observers described it as enormous. Travelers had chipped pieces from it over generations, yet much of the mass remained. In 1820, An expedition involving Henry Schoolcraft documented the boulder and attempted to move it. They failed. But eventually someone succeeded. In the 1840s, businessman Julius Eldred acquired a claim involving the boulder. Its removal was opposed by Ojibwe interests. Eldred nevertheless undertook the enormous task of moving the copper. Using rollers, mechanical equipment, and extensive labor, he eventually transported the nearly 2-ton mass toward the river. From there, its journey continued. Detroit, Washington, and eventually the Smithsonian Institution. The boulder became the subject of a complicated legal dispute over ownership. The government ultimately took possession of it, and Eldred was compensated. Today, the object remains in Washington, but its story is bigger than the copper itself. It illustrates a recurring pattern in the history of the region. Indigenous knowledge existed first. Then outsiders arrived. They documented the landscape. They claimed objects. They created legal records. And often, the people whose ancestors had known the landscape longest were barely represented in those official records. For the Ojibwe, copper was not simply another mineral waiting to be removed from the ground. Traditional accounts connected the copper-bearing waters and lands to spiritual beings and responsibilities. One of the most important figures in Ojibwe tradition is Mishibizu, often described as an underwater panther associated with the depths of the Great Lakes. Copper appears within this symbolic world. That means the ancient mines cannot be fully understood simply by measuring pits and weighing metal. There was also a cultural relationship with the landscape. The ground was not merely a warehouse of resources. The lake was not merely a transportation route. And copper was not merely an economic commodity. The archaeological evidence and indigenous traditions are therefore telling different parts of the same story. One preserves physical traces. The other preserves cultural memory. For a long time, Western institutions treated one as evidence and the other as folklore. That distinction has increasingly become difficult to defend. For the Ojibwe, copper was not simply another mineral waiting to be removed from the ground. Traditional accounts connected the copper-bearing waters and lands to spiritual beings and responsibilities. One of the most important figures in Ojibwe tradition is Mishibizu, often described as an underwater panther associated with the depths of the Great Lakes. Copper appears within this symbolic world. That means the ancient mines cannot be fully understood simply by measuring pits and weighing metal. There was also a cultural relationship with the landscape. The ground was not merely a warehouse of resources. The lake was not merely a transportation route. And copper was not merely an economic commodity. The archaeological evidence and indigenous traditions are therefore telling different parts of the same story. One preserves physical traces. The other preserves cultural memory. For a long time, Western institutions treated one as evidence and the other as folklore. That distinction has increasingly become difficult to defend. Today, Royale is protected as a national park. The ancient mining pits remain scattered through the island's forests. Some are obvious. Others are almost invisible beneath vegetation. Moss grows over old excavations. Trees rise from ancient spoil heaps. The landscape has had thousands of years to reclaim the places where people once worked the rock. And yet the evidence has not disappeared. It is simply hidden. Modern LiDAR technology is changing that. Instead of relying entirely on what a person can see while walking through dense forest, researchers can examine detailed measurements of the terrain. Subtle depressions can reveal old mining pits. Raised areas can indicate discarded rock. Patterns invisible from the ground can emerge from above. And some of these features were not included in older maps. The inventory continues to grow, which raises an intriguing possibility. We may still not know how many ancient workings exist across the island. Think about the timeline. The ancient miners began working native copper thousands of years ago. They returned season after season. They built fires against rock. They fractured stone with water. They hammered copper free. They transported it. They shaped it into tools, weapons, fishing equipment, and ornaments. And some of that metal traveled enormous distances. Then generations passed. The mining tradition eventually declined. The forests returned. Centuries became millennia. European explorers arrived. Industrial mining companies came next. And in the 19th century, modern miners suddenly encountered the remains of the older industry beneath their own claims. They had expected untouched wilderness. Instead, they found an ancient workplace. And the more they searched, the more of it appeared. But one question remained. What happened to the copper? We have objects. We have mines. We have trade routes. We have burial sites. We have historical accounts. But the quantities do not add up neatly. A huge portion of the metal appears to have disappeared from the archaeological record. Maybe it traveled farther than we can currently trace. Maybe it was recycled again and again. Maybe undiscovered caches are still waiting beneath the forest. Or perhaps several explanations are true at once. There is no final answer yet, and that uncertainty may be the most honest part of the story. There is another mystery that is less about copper and more about memory. For decades, the story of these mines was told as though the identity of their builders were unknowable. But that was never quite true. Indigenous communities had their own histories. Researchers had physical evidence. The pits themselves showed the sophistication of the work. And eventually archaeology caught up. The question was never simply, who could have built something like this? The better question was, why were people so reluctant to recognize the people who actually lived here? That question changes the entire story. Because the ancient mines are not evidence of some lost civilization arriving from somewhere else. They are evidence of what indigenous societies of the Great Lakes were capable of doing. They organized labor. They understood the geology. They developed practical techniques for extracting native copper. They manufactured specialized objects. They traded across enormous distances. And they maintained these traditions across thousands of years. That is already extraordinary. It does not need a mystery civilization added to it. Today, visitors can walk across Royale and pass through a landscape that looks almost untouched. But beneath the trees are scars left by people who lived thousands of years ago. A shallow depression might be a forgotten shaft. A pile of stones might be discarded mining debris. A patch of forest might be growing over a workplace older than almost every written history of North America. And somewhere within that landscape may be the missing piece of the copper story. Perhaps there are still undiscovered workings. Perhaps there are caches. Perhaps future chemical analysis will connect more artifacts to Lake Superior. Perhaps new research will explain how much copper was really extracted. But even if the missing metal is never found, the mines have already revealed something remarkable. The ancient Great Lakes were not an isolated world. They were part of a vast network of people, technology, trade, and cultural knowledge. And that network existed thousands of years before European ships appeared on Lake Superior. The miners who worked these rocks left no written engineering manuals. They left no industrial records. They left no photographs. They left only the physical evidence of what they accomplished. Pits in the stone, charred rock, ancient tools, copper objects, burial goods, and traditions carried forward by indigenous communities. The forest eventually covered their work, but it never completely erased it. And when 19th century miners broke through the ground and found ancient shafts beneath their feet, they thought they had discovered something strange. In reality, they had discovered something much more profound. They had stumbled onto the remains of an industry that had already been operating for thousands of years. An industry created by people whose descendants were still living around the same Great Lakes. And perhaps the greatest irony is that the copper was never truly lost. It was simply scattered, across tools, across graves, across trade routes, across generations, and beneath the forests of Royale and the Keweenaw, where thousands of ancient pits still wait to be fully mapped. The ground has been holding this story for thousands of years. We are only now learning how to read it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more historical mysteries, forgotten discoveries, and stories hidden beneath the surface of the past. And remember, sometimes the most extraordinary evidence is not sitting inside a museum. Sometimes it is still buried exactly where someone left it thousands of years ago.